So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first meeting of the academic year of the Minerva Seminar. We are happy to welcome also the students of the
Disaster Management Graduate Program in the School of Environmental Sciences.
So welcome. Welcome to our Minerva team. And I must say that the beginning of the academic year and the interaction with the students and the seminars are a little sign of optimism, at least for me, in our very tough circumstances. And I think that there is no better topic to talk about today than the topic that Limor will present. We are very happy to have Dr. Limor Yehuda with us. She is currently a postdoctoral at the Minerva Center and also at the Truman Institute at the Hebrew University. And we are actually celebrating her new book, which is based on her doctoral dissertation, which won first prize, the Show Prize for the outstanding doctoral dissertation in the fields of public international law and human rights. And the book is entitled Collective Equality, Human Rights and Democracy in the Resolution of Ethno-National Conflict and Peace. It was published by Cambridge University Press just recently. So Limor, welcome. Limor will present her book for 25 minutes, and then we'll have some comments from Professor Sandy Kedar and Professor Itamar Mann, principal investigators at the center. Limor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ellie, and thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Itamar, for accepting the invitation to be part of that, and thank you all for coming. I will say that what motivated me to do this research that the book is based on was a need to seek new answers to the reality of endless conflict and occupation, and because of the dead end in which the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians has reached. And it seems like there is no, I don't need to prove it in the current situation. Recent events, again, so in my presentation today, I will not talk about the recent events, and not with the legal questions that relate to the military operations or to what's happening now, the humanitarian situation in Gaza, but with questions that assume long-term perspective that are crucial, I think, for having useful answers to what needs to be done now. The book draws on research in multiple fields, both on empirical and theoretical accounts and on comparative analysis of three other conflicts, the Bosnia-Herzegovina conflict, the conflict in Northern Ireland, and the conflict and peace processes in Cyprus. And based on renewed understanding of violent conflicts, the book opens a long set of issues. Among them, what are the advantages and limitations of partition as a solution to violent conflicts? What are the limitations of liberal democracy? Yeah. So it's a long list. So I'm saying them just to say that I will not be able to deal with all of them. But partition, what are the advantages and limitations? What are the limitations of liberal democracy in such places? Why the use of power sharing models of democracy became a central tool of peacemaking? What are the primary objections, political and legal, raised against them? What is the legal and theoretical problem with those kinds of solutions? What is collective equality, which is a concept that I offer in the book? What is the innovation it offers? What is the if it can, aligns with a liberal conception of justice and with existing international law, and how it helps, I hope I managed to argue sensibly for that, how it helps to reconcile between prevailing political perceptions about conflict and peace and liberal justice perception. So those are all questions that I ask or struggle with in the book. And today, my modest aim will be to outline some of the key elements that bring me to develop collective equality as a concept, a new conception of justice, and as a legal concept. And I start my analysis with the Bosnian case. Actually, I start with the end, with the beginning of the end. There is no end. In November 1995, a dramatic peace agreement was signed between the three sides to the Bosnian War. That is the Dayton Peace Agreement. The sides to the war were three ethnic groups, ethno-national groups. One are Bosniaks, which are Bosnian Muslims. Second is Bosnian Serbs, Christian Orthodox, and the third is Bosnian Croats, which are Christian Catholics. The Bosnian War erupted during the disintegration process of Yugoslavia, and specifically following the declaration of independence of Bosnia. And the adoption, and I specifically mention it, most of the time it's not mentioned, so it's a combination of the independence of Bosnia and the decision that Bosnia will be a majoritarian democratic state, okay, liberal democracy. This political decision to become an independent state was objected to by one of these groups, the Bosnian Serbs. They were around a third of the population of Bosnia. But their rejection was rejected, and the independence went with, both locally and by international community. But the Serbs were the most powerful group in the former Yugoslavia. They had actually controlled the Yugoslav army. And following the independence and the adoption of democracy by Bosnia, so what it meant for the Bosnian Serbs, these two political actions, it meant that Bosnian Serbs become a minority within the newly independent Bosnia. This is one thing. And the second is that effectively they are losing their collective political status and becoming not only a demographic minority, but actually also a political minority, as exemplified by the decision to go on independence, although they rejected it. Okay, although they objected to it, and they also had other objections that were rejected by the international community. The declaration led to a horrific war. This is Bosnia. This is the map of the land of Yugoslavia, and Bosnia is in the middle. So following the declaration, a horrific war between the three ethno-national groups erupted. The logic of the war was ethnic cleansing, ethnic separation, and following by ethnic cleansing. Both the new minority Serbs and minority Croats aimed to create mono-ethnic territories, to ease the annexation of these territories to Serbia and Croatia. If we look at the map, it's not that. To ease the annexation of those new mono-ethnic territories to the nearby Croatia and Serbia. This separation strategy was poorly executed through a deliberate policy of ethnic cleansing. Here are some figures to illustrate when I mean horrific what I mean. More than 100,000 people are killed, millions of refugees and ethnically internally displaced. We have systematic rape as a strategy of war. Rape camps between 12,000 and 50,000 women estimated as being raped systematically. Torture, and also an incident of genocide, declared genocide by an international court. Between 7,000 and 8,000 people had been murdered at that incident. Why do I tell you all those things? Because to understand that when we're talking about violent conflicts, this is those situations that we need to deal with. Okay. only after 3.5 years of war, following intense, partly coercive mediation that was led by the US, they managed to get a peace agreement that we saw. So ethnic separation was the idea and the leading force of the war of ethnic cleansing, reaching, after this 3.5 years, reaching a peace agreement by coercive mediation from the US. Part of the major element of that agreement was the new constitution of Bosnia, but in contrast to the liberal majoritarian democracy model that was initially adopted for Bosnia, the Dayton Constitution recognizes the three ethnic groups as the constituent peoples of Bosnia and Herzegovina and reshapes Bosnia democracy as a power-sharing democracy between them. So what's the problem? Is there a problem with that? It seems okay, right? So some of the new constitutional arrangements are based on the ethno-national affiliation, subjectively defined, of citizens. The two primary arrangements that use ethno-national affiliation are the presidency of Bosnia. It's not a typical presidency. Actually, this is the presidency of three people. In rotation, the leadership of that presidency, each of them representing one of the groups. The second central arrangement is the House of Peoples. It's the upper legislature. So they have two legislatures, two parliaments. One, the lower house, which is universally elected, and then the upper house, which is the House of Peoples, 15 delegates, 5 representing each of the three groups. And the number of those, it's irrespective of the size of the population. The three groups are not equally distributed in Bosnia. The Bosniaks are nearly half, the Serbs are third, and the Croats are around 18%. So who are not eligible to run for those offices, for these high offices of the presidency and the House of Peoples? People that do not affiliate themselves with any of the three groups. Okay? Like those two people, those are Mr. Sejic and Mr. Finci, citizens of Bosnia from a Roma and Jewish origin. And I met actually with Finci when I was in Sarajevo. They both petitioned the European Court of Human Rights in 2009, they petitioned in 2006. It means 11 years after the end of the war and the peace agreement. And maybe I should mention that when the peace agreement was signed, there were very few that believed it will hold. Okay, many thought that it will be just a piece of paper, and many peace agreements actually end that way. Many peace agreements do not hold, and we see return to violence. So in Bosnia, it was like that. It was somehow most of the people expected that it will not hold and war will return, but it holds. And that was in 95, but in 2006, the situation is different, has been stabilized, and they petitioned the European Court of Human Rights. And in 2009, the court accepts their petition and declares that those constitutional arrangements that I just mentioned, the presidency and the House of People, are discriminatory arrangements because they use distinctions based on ethnic grounds and actually classifies them. The court classifies those arrangements as racial discrimination. And this is a quote from the court. In this context, where a difference in treatment is based on race or ethnicity, the notion of objective and reasonable justification must be interpreted as strictly as possible. The court has also held that no difference in treatment which is based exclusively or to a decisive extent on a person's ethnic origin is capable of being objectively justified in a contemporary democratic society built on the principles of pluralism and respect for different cultures. Thus, the court concludes that the applicant's continued ineligibility to stand for election to the House of Peoples of Bosnia and Herzegovina and also for the presidency lacks an objective and reasonable justification. So what we see here is a conflict or grave discrepancy between the political logic underlying leading approaches to peace in places of group conflict. I brought only the Bosnian case, but this is the use of power sharing democracy is a leading tool in peacemaking these days. So between the political logic and international human rights law. And this is not only a legal tension, but represents common opinions about what is legitimate, what is advisable, and what is appropriate. And within liberal paradigms, political and constitutional arrangements of power sharing that rely on ethnic identities are regarded as discriminatory and flawed, even within the literature that deals with those arrangements. The fact that the court stamped these arrangements with the tag of racial discrimination says it more than anything else. Who wants to be involved in racist arrangements? Usually, these tensions are framed in the literature as peace versus justice. This framing suggests that maintaining ethnic power-sharing arrangements implies compromising on justice considerations to achieve peace, and even more problematically, it may be seen as surrendering to force. Okay? So it's not just those arrangements, but what can we do because we don't want to go back to war? So in the book, I show that this common conceptualizations of the tension as peace versus justice is not accurate and even misleading. It is based on a limited understanding of the causes for the outbreak of ethno-national conflicts and of the pragmatic and just ways to deal with them in the 21st century. And what I want to expose is that the common theoretical perceptions and legal obligations constrain the development of more complex understandings and disrupt not only politics, but also justice. And building on contemporary research findings about the structural causes of ethnic conflicts, I suggest adding to our normative system a new principle, which I term collective equality. So what are those new and contemporary findings? Okay, so I go back to understanding ethno-national conflicts. This is the general framework I use, ethno-national conflicts. By taking this frame, I do not mean that other frames of describing those situations are irrelevant. And in fact, many contemporary conflicts, including Israeli-Palestinian, fall also under other theoretical frames. But for my analysis, I prefer this frame as I find it capturing core elements of the situation, includes abundance of useful data and theoretical insights, and does not preclude, but actually in line with central features of other frameworks. Empirical research shows that ethno-national conflicts are the most common type of conflicts in recent history. You remember that slide? As of 2000, more than 80% of conflicts in the world fall under this category. This has not changed in the last 2 decades, if you look at the database of conflicts. The definition of ethno-national conflicts I use is this one. Situations in which 2 or more groups pursue incompatible goals to self-determination, where at least one of the parties interprets the conflict, its causes and potential solutions along an ethnic divide. 3 parts of the definition. One is that it's conflict among 2 groups or more. At least one of the sides defines itself in ethnic terms and its goals in terms of self-determination, national self-determination. And then the question is, who are ethnic groups? It's a subset of, this is the definition I use. Of course, there are other definitions, but this I think is representative. Subset of identity categories in which eligibility for membership is determined by attributes associated with or believed to be associated with descent. And most nations are also ethnic groups. Okay, so there are many discussions about what is ethnicity, nationalism. There are a lot of interpretations into those concepts, but as an empirical descriptive attempt, that's something that we should acknowledge. Nations are mostly also ethnic groups. Okay. What are the causes of ethnic conflicts? So while common beliefs understand ethnic or ethno-national conflicts as resulting from ethnic diversity like, okay, we are diverse, there is no possibility of that, or rooted in irrational ancient hatreds. What research, empirical research, global research shows that those two are not good explanations to why conflicts erupt. Okay, and what is found in the empirical research is that what we see that those are struggles over political power, and actually about the question who will control the state, or state power, or state's power, and practically which group will control or dominate the other. Who will control who, and which will be politically excluded from political powers. The most explosive cases, like the case that we saw in Bosnia, are when dominant group lose or about to lose its power. Empirical research also finds that correlation between political exclusion, but not only, between inequality among groups and the outbreak of violent conflicts. In the literature, it's called horizontal inequality. So looking at the relation between the groups, and when we have extreme differences, inequalities between the groups, in those, so this is one division to look at the inequalities in socioeconomic inequalities, political inequalities, meaning who is sitting and having the power to decide, and cultural inequalities. Cultural meaning, usually when we look at the escalation of conflicts, what we see mostly is that some cultural issue is the trigger, but it's not by itself the cause of the conflict. What we usually have is also socioeconomic as the baseline, and political inequalities like exclusion from political decision making as a reason for political elites to mobilize the masses. Other characteristics that I want to flag, which I think are crucial to understand those conflicts. First, they are not only internal. When I talk about ethno-national conflicts, I think the idea is, okay, we're talking about internal conflicts. It's not only internal. Most of those conflicts are also cross-border. They are both internal and international. And we can see both in Northern Ireland, in Bosnia, and Cyprus. It depends how much it is international and how much is internal, depends on each of the conflicts, but you see it as a cross-border issue. And if you look only within the borders of the states, most of the time you will not understand the full problem or the full conflict. Another thing is that they involve existential fear, okay? And it's not only for one of the sides, but actually both sides are experiencing existential fear, because it's either us control them or they will control us. There is no other way to deal with the situation, so we must control. And the other is a double majority, double minority syndrome. Both sides, or if there are more than two, it's possible, all of them think that they are eligible and they have good arguments why they should be the ones that rule. Okay? So this is the majority, and we can have different realization or different justification for why is it. Is it because we are the majority, or maybe because we are the natives of this place, and so forth. There are different reasons why we believe not we, but the people involved in conflict believe that they should be the majority and the ruling party. But they also, because they feel existential fear, they also feel like a threatened minority. And what we see is that the worst behaviors of both are in play in such conflict. So what I want, a bottom line regarding conflict is that what are common conceptions, particularly overlook collective injustice that are root causes of conflict, disregarded the existential struggle for domination, and the accompanying existential fear for all sides, and failed to see the full scope of the conflict because of methodological nationalism, what I said, that we see only within the borders. So the second part of my argument examines the severe limitations of the natural, what are regarded as the natural or proper solutions to such conflicts, partition and liberal democracy. So as these conflicts are framed and perceived as struggles for self-determination, by definition, my definition, traditionally the obvious solution was partition, the establishment of a new independent nation state. In legal terms, external self-determination. But three central reasons I bring why partition is at best a partial solution to ethno-national conflicts. First, in many cases, partition is legally denied. Okay, this is not relevant in our case in Israel-Palestine, but it is relevant in most conflicts around the world, and this relates to how the right to self-determination under international law has been interpreted. It was interpreted territorially and not nationally. Okay, and it's part of the legal interpretation, the alternative legal interpretation that I offer. Okay? So first of all, it's legally denied in most cases. For example, in Cyprus case, or in Bosnia, or in it is rejected. It's not part of the possible legitimate solution. But for us, it's not relevant because partition is part of the political approach. But second is that in most cases of conflict, the disputed territories are ethnically mixed. They are not homogeneous. It's not that we can have a line, any kind of territorial line that will create new homogenic territories after this new division. So in a way, if we regard ethnic mixture as a problem, we are not getting rid of that problem. We remain with ethnic mixture that we need to deal with even after partition. And then the question, how do we deal with the remaining? Even if we go into partition, what do we do with the remaining ethnic mixture? So there are commentators, and we know also contemporary politicians that advise population transfers. And this suggestion with regard to native populations is also rejected based on legal, pragmatic, and ethical grounds. I'm saying this is the notions today. It was not so 100 years ago. For example, in the peace agreement between Turkey and Greece, 100 years ago, it was part of the deal, a willful population transfer. Okay, millions of people had been transferred, more than a million. I think 1 million from one side and 400,000 people from the other. And I brought this because that was last year. So in Greece, it marked still 100 years later as a catastrophe. Okay? But so my argument is that this, what used to be something that is a tool of peacemaking, is no longer regarded as legal or moral or pragmatic. And if we look also into the specific cases, the Northern Ireland case, for example, so Ireland was divided, okay? But the ethnic mixture was not resolved. And this is only Northern Ireland. As we know, Northern Ireland was also experiencing violent conflict since the 60s until the late 90s. And I will just say that partition was never really offered there because there is no line that makes any sense. Okay, so they knew that they cannot resolve this conflict with the use of partition. The same is with Bosnia in a way. Although, so at the beginning of the war, there was no sense of making any kind of partition beyond the fact that it was legally denied. But in the end of the war, it was more possible pragmatically because we saw that the practice was ethnic cleansing, but even at the end of the war, it was not totally homogeneous. And then we had Cyprus. This is at the time of independence. Again, there is no line that can divide the two sides. And this is Israel-Palestine. And this is the line that we used to see as the dividing line for partition. But still, it's hard to capture that. But even if we do partition in Israel-Palestine, we remain with large populations on the other side of the border. And the bottom line for me is to understand the unattainability of separation, of ethnic separation as part of conflict resolution, and that partition at best can be part of the solution. At worst, it can trigger large-scale political violence, as we saw in different partitions around the world. But at best, so if we're taking the best is that it's part of the solution, but not the whole solution. The second, I don't know how I'm with time. How much?
5
minutes. Okay. The second natural solution is liberal democracy. Of course, it's a problem. It's a huge topic. I raise a modest argument, and I recall that that liberal democracy is what is viewed by the Human Rights Court as the proper model of democracy that Bosnia needs to be aligned with. And generally speaking, this model is based on majority rule with protections for individual and minority rights. And despite the importance of human rights, of course, nobody can argue against that, I think, or there are some, but not. So I would say that this political model, this combination, is not suitable for deeply divided places. And basically because it's not able for different reasons, but also building on empirical research. For example, the research that Kymlicka does. It's showing why in places of deeply divided, the multicultural theory and minority rights are not implemented, are not working because of this mistrust, because of security dilemmas and so forth. And what we end up with is actually legitimation for domination of the ethnic majority. And then we go to power sharing as the rising tool in the last few decades, as the rising tool of peacemaking. And because we are talking about ethnic identification of groups, it means that we're talking about ethnic power sharing. And what we see also is that we have arrangements that relate to power sharing within the country and cross-border arrangements that also deal with the connections, because we are looking at a conflict that has wider implications than only one state. It has, okay, I'll skip that, or no, I cannot. So what's characterizing power sharing is grand coalition. Grand coalition means that there is mandatory membership in the government of major population groups of the country. So there is no losing minority. Okay, all of them have a seat around the table. Proportional representation, autonomy on cultural issues, and veto powers in order to protect vital interests of the groups. And okay, I go back to the human rights versus power sharing. This is the beginning of the problem that I started with, and I will try to see how I am squeezing everything. I will, okay, so, so if you remember what the court said, the misrecognition of the court of the legitimate interest of ethno-national groups, I say, is not accidental, but reflects prevailing liberal perceptions that regard ethno-nationalism as repulsive, and established international understandings of human rights and international law. Okay, so which are highly individualistic. And 14 years had passed, but still the court decision has not been implemented. Okay. So to sum up, I argue that our normative system is flawed when applied to deeply divided places, and we need to adjust it. And to amend it, I offer this concept of collective equality. The core of this is that I look at national groups, national collectives, as they define themselves, and argue that they should be recognized as equals to one another. Okay, I go back to what should have been, from my understanding, the understanding of the right to self-determination, not as it had been interpreted by international law. And what I bring also is not only the relation to national collectives, but also bringing in equality in the sense of relational equality. Equality can have a lot of meanings, but I focus here on relational equality, meaning if we have a way to go out of the domination trap, it's like the understanding or the perception of the sides of the conflict of it's whether us or them on the top. There is no way other than that, so we have to be on the top because we don't want to be in the bottom. The only alternative to this internal struggle is actually equality. It's not you and not me, but both of us are independent but interdependent because we cannot be separated. And basically, it calls for equal rights, fair system of cooperation, because we cannot be separated. We need some kind of arrangements that will deal with the disagreements. We need to have relations that will support these ongoing relations that are there, if we want it or not. Equal recognition and respect. It's part of collective equality and as I said, relational equality. Okay, you will say, okay, just a second, and go the wrong way. Is it naive, you think? Right, that's the question. So my answer is not only that no, that it's not naive, and I recall that what I based on is actually on the political practice, not on the legal or justice ideals, but I come from the practice. And the practice shows that this is the way to make sustainable peace. And so I will say not only that it's not naive, it's the only realistic way forward. So let me see. Okay, I will end here, I think. I have much more to say.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Limor.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so first, I want to really extend my congratulations to Limor on the publishing of this book in the prestigious Cambridge University Press earlier this year. And this remarkable book consists of around 350 pages and is divided into introduction, 3 main sections, and a conclusion. The book is important, innovative, and thought-provoking. It provides a comprehensive and interdisciplinary analysis of scholarly work and integrates it into a sophisticated and original thesis. I was asked to read only the introduction and the conclusion, and therefore my comments and questions are limited to what I have read. And yeah, but I was asked, yeah. Well, that's what I did. And it is possible that the answer, for the time being, yeah, of course, and it is possible that the answers to my questions can be found in other places of the book. So it's more questions than actual assertions. Now, I have several comments and questions. According to my understanding, at least in deeply divided society, the book clearly prioritizes the importance of peace and collective identity over customary liberal principles. However, I find the normative basis of it to be insufficiently clear. In liberal theory, the individual human being is a source of norms, and the state is a means to achieve this liberal vision. While there are many references in the book, and we talked about them a bit here, to leading scholarship and scholars, I'm not sure that I found a sufficient normative explanation for the proposal of the book to bestow equality on intrastate ethno-national groups and giving it preference over the values, over liberal values. In the liberal tradition, every individual possesses equal intrinsic value compared to others. However, proposing the concept of collective equality most probably leads to the conclusion that my voice is not equivalent to that of other individuals within the society. The weight of the individual may vary based on the relative weight of each of the recognized ethno-national collectives in the territorial unit. Thus, a fundamental principle, for example, of equal representation, the right to vote and to be elected, where each individual vote has equal weight, is compromised. Dr. Yehuda acknowledges that ethnic identities are neither genetic nor primordial. But in actuality, her approach to these collective identities seems to constrict and squeeze different and differing individuals into these solidified collectivities. But many of us have multiple and sometimes conflicting identities and refuse to be confined to a single predominant one. Moreover, there exist intermediate identities, you talked about two in your examples, and not all individuals or even groups can easily be categorized into one ethno-national collective. For instance, in Israel-Palestine, there are additional ethnic groups such as Druze or Samaritans, a large number of non-Jewish Israelis from former Soviet unions, and others. Although Yehuda recognized the many components that contribute to an ethnic identity, I believe she underestimates the significant power of religion as an autonomous force, as we've seen recently. It is not always just a component of an identity formation. Sometimes it has a strong independent force. For instance, in the Jewish-Palestinian struggle, while Jews are more or less of the same religion, and this is even not clear, if you ask Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews, Reform, they're not really Jews or whatever. So even if they are more or less of the same religion, the Palestinians vary, and this variation influences their collective identity, such as Druze and various streams of Christianity. Conversely, fundamentalist religion and beliefs shown by groups like the Hamas and some factions within the religious Zionist Chardal movement can often take precedence over ethnic identification. You explain, page 29, for instance, that while there are other frameworks to analyze the situation, you chose a national one, I quote. Notably, when I mainly use the ethno-national frame, I do not argue that this is the only relevant or useful frame of analysis. This is true mainly regarding to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been increasingly analyzed through the settler colonial frame in apartheid. But I remain unconvinced by your choice. In the part I read, I think that no sufficient weight is accorded to distinction between homeland communities or national communities and settler colonial situations. While there are overlaps, I think that the situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina might be different from the other ones, which are closer to a settler colonial situation. So I'm speaking of, I mean, it depends what time frame, but of course, when we're talking about Ireland, Northern Ireland, or Cyprus in Israel, we have at least an occupied territory, or even in a situation of settler colonialism, which has different peculiarities. I've yet to see a rationale for the selection of the three primary case studies, with Israel being mentioned only in the conclusion, as far as I understand. It is worth considering additional instances that may challenge the thesis you presented in the book. For instance, South Africa has not embraced a collective equality approach, but, looks quite interesting. And on the other hand, Lebanon has chosen this kind of power sharing approach, and it doesn't look like a great solution to me. These and other case studies have the potential to weaken the overall argument put out in the book. Also, are there instances of partitions that were successful or not at all? And also the fact that you say that it is contrary to international law, but also your argument is contrary to prevailing international law. So, I mean, this is not an argument if you offer a solution. Furthermore, the book critiques the ruling of the European Court of Human Rights and the collective power sharing agreement in Bosnia-Herzegovina. However, at least in the parts I read, I don't see an answer to the question, what were the consequences of these rulings or other like that? So now I heard it's not implemented, but does it have any kind of power at all? The ruling was just that I just don't know. Did at least did a chaotic and tumultuous situation occur? Alternative non-violent arrangements were devised, which give more weight to human individual rights and identities. I would also like a discussion of the costs associated with selecting collective identity framework. What will be the cost incurred by minorities within minorities, such as women and other minority groups? Additionally, I'm concerned that this choice may reinforce and prolong ethnic identities rather than promoting less confrontational and multifaceted ones. You write that ethno-national conflicts are struggles over domination, over who controls the nation state, or more broadly, who will be superior and dominate the other. However, which method do you provide that will prevent the various national collective groups from persistently attempting to outdo one another and undermine the solution you propose? You contend that your approach embodies a realistic utopia. However, I remain unpersuaded by its realist nature and do not concur with the utopia you are proposing. Finally, you devote only 3 pages in the conclusion to Israeli-Palestine situation. Can you expand a bit more and also say something about how the events unfolding after October 7th and the horrible situation that follows, how does it influences, if at all, your view? And my last maybe comment, because we were talking about it, about the Israeli-Palestinian situation. I mean, at least in the occupied territories, I mean, there are very few, very recent, relatively recent people living there. And I'm talking about settlers. I mean, you can imagine a situation where you move 100,000 people and get to a relatively, at least in the occupied territory, a relatively homogeneous partition.
I will go to the numbers.
Here, Itamar first, and then reaction.
Thanks, Limor, for sharing the introduction and the conclusion to this fascinating and important book. I think it's an ambitious book. I hope to read. I will read more of it. I feel like I enjoyed what I've already encountered, and that by the nature of the introduction and conclusion, what I have encountered is mainly a theoretical argument, and an argument grounded on principles of justice, principles of philosophical ideas, and also discussing them in the context of international law. What I've less seen is the actual kind of case studies. And even from your presentation here, I've learned a lot about the richness of the project and the way that it kind of brings together different contexts in a very sensitive and thought-provoking way. So I think it's a very, very recommended book, very important book indeed. I want to open my comments with a set of reflections on the very idea of collective equality, which is, I think, a very, very clever title, and I want to explain why I think that is the case. So in international law, we do not have collective equality, as Limor says rightly. What we do have is 2 ideas that each kind of connect with one part of this dual phrase. We have collective security under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. I'll explain immediately what that is. And we have sovereign equality, which is under Article 1 of the UN Charter. In each of these ideas is a basic fundamental component of the public international law order. I will not call it the liberal world order because I don't think it comports entirely with liberal principles, but it is the law. And they are somehow complementary with each other. and they paint a different worldview from the one that Limaud is painting. They paint a different worldview from the liberal one, as I just described. And the importance of Limaud's intervention is in its radical critique and polemic critique against both the international law vision and the liberal vision. So only reading the introduction and the conclusion, I read this as an extremely polemical book, really trying to go against the very basic fundamentals of public international law. Okay. Collective security is the idea that basically stated is the idea that the UN Charter provides authorization for the Security Council, mainly, to impose measures, including the use of force, in order to reach international peace and security, in order to attack, including in the context of military action, in order to reach decisions such as to attack a country. This happened, for example, in the context of the Balkans War. It happened in the context of the first war in Iraq. And the basic idea is that the purpose of the international order is to preserve peace and security. And it's an idea of top-down governance. It's an idea that basically, very roughly stated, that the powerful governments that have veto in the Security Council have a role in imposing forcefully peace from above. And what is Limaud's peace or security from above? And what is peace and security here? Of course, it's a debated question, and of course, it will be a political question. But I think the emphasis is on stability, on the idea that war will be the very only last resort of any kind of political outcome. And what is Limaud's critique of this idea of collective security? I think she doesn't address it directly. That it is precisely this top-down nature is something that she doesn't like in a very, very basic sense. She emphasizes long-term processes, and she wants a kind of purchase coming from below, and her reach out to this ethnic national category that Sandy has very much emphasized, and I will go back to that, is precisely for that reason. She says, well, we cannot wish for global peace and security or collective security if we don't have a purchase within the nations that need to exist together on an everyday basis over years. Okay, that's one criticism. Now, sovereign equality. Sovereign equality is the other bedrock that I want to touch on. Sovereign equality is the fundamental idea also in the UN Charter that states are the representatives of their peoples, of their citizens, and also they have exclusive, generally speaking, jurisdiction over the persons within their territory and responsibility over their human rights. So in a way, public international law, what it tries to do is take this globe that we all live in, divide it into puzzle pieces, and every puzzle piece will be covered by a particular government, except for the seas. Perhaps that's for another day. But on land, there will be a very strict division of responsibility for individuals according to state jurisdiction, and in their relationships with one another, states are, so to speak, equal. They come to the table. Even if you're Botswana and the United States, I don't know. I have nothing against Botswana, of course, but a relatively weak country and a very relatively strong country, you have this fiction, this imagination that they each will have in international proceedings an equal footing. And here, Limaud doesn't like that either. She doesn't like that either. She is speaking totally against that. Her argument is against sovereign equality, because she thinks equality needs to be between nations, needs to be between a subnational category, and that overturns completely the idea of sovereign equality, because you cannot have it both ways. You cannot have it both ways, and if you're going for Limor's outcome or proposal, you need to know that you are flushing down the toilet the existing public international order with all of its faults. So we don't know how to conclude agreements anymore. We do not have an operating UN anymore. And all of these things that are surely very far from perfect, they are surely deeply flawed. We do not have the possibility to appeal to them anymore. And here I think this is an underemphasized aspect of the book that I would like to hear more about. Now, I don't know how. 2 minutes. I have also prepared a short defense of two models that I think that deserve more attention and that are discarded in your argument. And one of them is the model that I think Sandy emphasized, which is the individual. And here I really do agree with most of what Sandy said, that this category that you speak for, which I think we should call the nation, even though it's not the state, it's reifying the identity of our own identities. And so if there is a kind of brushing away of this idea of equality within a liberal context, and I want to think that going to the Israel-Palestine example that comes at the end, that we have too quickly discarded that possibility. We've too quickly pushed it aside. Of course, we have some theoretical discussions or kind of general principle discussions about the possibility of one person, one vote in the territory of Israel-Palestine. But there is no real attempt to hash out what that might mean. How might an anti-apartheid movement in this context look like? And I think before we discard it, we have to try to imagine it within the particular context of our own situation. And here I echo Sandy's emphasis on groups that have an identity that is intersectional in many, many different ways. And we are, many of us are, and it's not by chance that he emphasized so much the Druze, which we, among our students, many, and our community or many are, to think about those kind of possibilities that are paradigmatic for our place, rather than just exceptions as we think of them normally. The other option, and I'm going to finish after that, is to think about community. Community is another category that is not developed. Despite the fact that you develop the nation, and the nation seems to be very ethnically oriented, it seems to be ancestral based, and there's a lot of political theory that is also not really discussed in the book, and I would like to hear more about hear more from you about is the idea that we can have a bottom-up arrangement, just like you want, but not one that is based on ethnic divides, but one that is based on real life situations of living together in a place and becoming a community in that way. And I want to share in this regard something that I'm kind of interested in and proud of in a way. I have a research assistant, a student. He gave me permission to discuss his work with you this afternoon. His name is Yaakov Goltzman, and he is now in Gaza in reserve duty. But before going before this war, we started discussing in the beginning of the summer Abdallah Öcalan's paper, Democratic Federalism. Abdallah Öcalan is the Kurdish leader who has been identified with the PKK in various moments and has been imprisoned for that reason for many years. He wrote about democratic federalism, and his political theory is recognized as a kind of anarchism in various circles. But his real interest is in community. It's in the idea that neighborhoods, that people that live together in actual, real life conditions can run their own businesses together, and that can be built somehow. These communities can form larger sets of communities and so on, and that can be kind of a political theory that would grow from the ground up. Yaakov wrote a paper trying to apply this model on Israel-Palestine. I hope it will be published at some point. but it was very, very interesting to read, especially against the background of emphasis of precisely those intersectional groups which form these kinds of nodes between communities that we do have in this place, and that if we think only on ethnic terms, we ignore. Okay, so that's all for today. Thank you again very much.
So thank you, Sandy and Itamar. I'll try my best. I promise not to address them or to be able to convince you. I can see that.
You have to limit yourself.
7 minutes so we can open the floor for.
Okay, I'll try very briefly. I think the basic assumption of both of you, I think, is that I give ethno-national groups superiority.
Absolutely.
Which I do not. What I give them, and if we go back to the court case, he rejected them totally as a legitimate concern within what we need to regard. Okay? So if we take, and what I do, I'm not banning or I'm not disqualifying the human rights perspective or the individual, and neither the state. Okay? I'm taking the world order as it is, and I'm saying, okay, we're missing something here. I'm adding something. And by saying that I'm adding something, I'm not throwing away all the things that we have. I'm adding into, and I'm a liberal, okay? And I'm adding into the liberal perspective this component which I regard as another level of justice, okay? And as we can have local justice, we can have different layers. If I'm arguing for equality between universities, for example, I'm not rejecting individual rights, right? So this is in a way the thing. If you're going into the labor law and you acknowledge the right, the collective right for strike, it's not overriding individual rights. This is the way that individual rights can be promoted by acknowledging the right of the collective. And this is in a way how I approach collective here. As you said, I'm building on a long tradition in many areas, also in the area of writing about justice. I'm within the liberal, and I take the collective as a way in which the individual can be safeguard its rights in such context. And therefore, my argument is limited to specific contexts and to specific kinds of collectives, which are national. So I think so. Both of you are assuming something that I do not say, deliberately do not say. I'm not with regard to overriding the private, the individual, and again, not the internet. So I'm not such a radical. I'm not going against the current international order. I think states are there, but what I disregard with both of you, and this is, I think, Sandy, what you're assuming or what you're holding to is methodological nationalism. Is like there is only the individual and the state. There is nothing else. And I say nothing else in a way that it's legitimate to look at politics or politics and law and justice in something that cross borders, because the reality is cross border. And the question is, because we have conflicts, okay? We see them, they are around here and in many other places. And the question is, how do we transition from them, right? This is the case. It's not that the situation now is great, it's only in our heads right? It's not in our heads. There is a real conflict. And the question is, how do you move out of it? What needs to happen, okay? So one answer, as I offered, is partition and separation, including population transfers, okay? This is a radical intervention in the current reality, okay? My argument is this is not the way to achieve peace or stability or security. You need some kind of an alternative. The alternative that the practice, not a naive practice, a real, in a way, those ideal terms that you bring of other kinds of justices are not related to the practice. Not only in the cases that I brought, but in the literature evolving conflicts in Africa and in other places. And also power sharing and ethnic power sharing has a lot of flaws, like liberal democracy. I'm not rejecting liberal democracy, okay?
I'm just saying you need to see what are the assumptions that those theoretical and political models, what are the conditions in reality that they need in order to succeed. And if you go to liberal democracy and to Mill argument about it, it says it's next to impossible when you do not have only one nation. Remember that, Mill? Okay. So we are in places which are multinational. What do we do with that? Okay. And I think we need to open up to other alternatives. The majoritarian liberal democracy has, definitely in the West, had controlled our view of what is a democracy. And in a way, my argument is democracy is more than that. There is this line of democracy. Switzerland is part of that. Belgium is part of that. The Netherlands. There are many other places where this kind of democracy is in play. And well, we can talk about it. I can. It's a long. I do not have to cover all of that to convince you, and I assume that I cannot convince all of you. But I think I have good arguments for that. Okay. Okay. Next. So I'm not an ideologist about nationalism. I look at reality and I see this is what I see. And if there is one thing that Jews and Palestinians here agree on, that they are not one of the same people. Maybe there's some that agree on, maybe there are some that will disagree. I think they are a negligible minority. So we both of us, and this is different from South Africa. Okay, South Africa. Why I did not choose that case to compare. I don't think. Of course, it's relevant to our situation and can be useful, but not to the primary understanding of the conflict and how to overcome that. In South Africa, the political choice of the grand majority of this situation was not national. They endorsed a political conception for South Africa that is one man, one vote for everybody. For everybody. Here, both Palestinians and Israelis do not adopt that idea.
In apartheid, they did not endorse it.
Not the whites, but at least the majority. But at least the majority of the blacks. That was the imagination for the new South Africa. Okay, and it's not part of. So I think, of course, there are things that can be compared, but I think we need to look at the core. And of course, we can argue about what are the core elements of our conflict. My understanding of the conflict, and I know it, and we all know it, my understanding of the conflict, that this is a primary understanding of the situation that we need to deal with. And the question is how we deal with it. And my answer is equality, cross-border equality. And one more thing is that I do not reject partition. I just say, what are the limitations to implement partition, also to our case? And if you're aiming for separation, it's not only 100,000 settlers that needs to be separated. You open up the question of Israeli Palestinian citizen. You're saying no, but if you take the logic of separation, it will not end where you want it to end.
I was laughing because you mentioned the Netherlands and Belgium, which are democratic, but are monarchies. And I wonder what the European Court of Human Rights would have said had I been a Dutch or a Belgian Jew and apply to the court saying, I cannot be a king. This is violation of equality. And what is the really difference between this and the presidential composition of Bosnia is an interesting question.
So Belgium, as you know, there were cases before the European Court of Human Rights.
About this question?
About questions of inequality regarding the arrangements, and the court rejected. This is another how you have a bias towards West versus
because the
East.
whole framing of equality versus or justice versus peace, which emerges from this court case, might not be correct. It's not peace versus justice. It's it's also justice. To have some kind of but I don't want to. I want to open.
That's my argument, actually, that it's not peace versus justice versus justice.
I get it.
I can ask a question. So I think it's share moral. I would say normative or conceptual assumptions that you bring to the table than Sandy and Itamar. So in that sense, I think we start from a more maybe similar background. I sort of deal a lot in my research with people self-determination, right? So the people is there, self-determination is there, and I think that it's
people like native,
people,
indigenous.
no people.
Okay.
Well, instead of nation, but that's for
Okay.
different. These are the right holders, right? Self-determination is a right of people in the articles of the relevant conventions. But that's not what it is. So, but I think that to go back to 1922 when the Greek-Turkish treaty with the so-called population exchange, maybe the challenge for those of us today who say let's look for other models is that it did succeed. Okay, you can commemorate it 100 years later as a catastrophe, but Turkish-Greeks armed conflict in a way ended then, or at least paused for many decades, again for different reasons. And if you look to the alternative at the time, which was the minority treaties, right, and the attempt not to follow this path and to try to give minorities their rights in their own territory. So 1920, you have this, but 30 years later, this is no longer the situation. That as a result of the Second World War, you had mass expulsion of populations everywhere in these multinational territories. And then somehow, after 45, in very violent, horribly violent ways, emerge much more homogeneous nation states, and then you can give small minorities the rights. It's much easier. And but of course, to say this is how it happened doesn't mean that this is what we want to follow. But to me, it seems that the challenge here is to explain how, again, based on the cases that you're dealing with, you can address the challenge of desecuritization of ethnic conflict. Because this is where it always falls apart, right? This is Lebanon. And this is, so who is eventually doing this basic Weberian task of the state, of monopoly over means of violence? So, and if you want to do power sharing around this, I think much of the challenge is there, is to somehow explain how that can happen.
How it can happen.
Exactly. Without very violent.
Yes, I agree. Should I answer that or okay, so I agree with that this is the very basic challenge. So I will say it's true that was the beginning, the half of the 20th century. That was the model of population transfers, either in this area or after the World War II. And I think our normative requirements have changed. Okay, so I think our evaluation of how do we approach population transfers is different, and to say, and I think even if we're now to do population transfers demands a lot of intervention, international. So it's not something easily. Okay, take your bag and move. Right? It's something that of a massive involvement that needs a lot of money, forces, whatever. So my argument against it, if we are aiming for such an intervention, we can invest it in something else. How about investing in putting in force or implementing what is needed in order for a multi-ethnic, multi-ethno-national political arrangement to be successful? And I am not underestimating the challenge. I'm just saying that I'm shifting what the challenge is, and it's not impossible. And I think, and I think it relates also to Sandy's question about Israel-Palestine and about after the 7th of October. And so I will just say, so regarding Israel-Palestine, I include the analysis of the conflict in the first chapters of the book, but I do not include it in the chapters where I developed collective equality because it was not relevant. Okay? And I go back to that in the end of the book and try to implement what the concept. But of course, I need to do it more. 3 pages. It's really difficult. Yes, I know. And of course, I need to write the Hebrew version differently. So I will do that, hopefully, in the near future. But so my research question during the last years is about the question of transition. And in a way, not only power sharing or this mixture, but bringing about a sustainable state that is not a failed state is not an easy task in itself. So it's not only about we're looking at a specific thing, but all places were a mix. Also France, like so, and the question of how you create homogenic states is also I deal with that. So even France needed a lot of coercive homogenization. So we don't want to, actually our standards today do not want to go into that. So we need to invest in bringing new answers to this challenge. It's a challenge. I'm not hiding from it. I'm just saying this is the challenge, and now we need to get really good, better answers because we have other standards of humanity that we want to uphold. And so this is about after the 7th of October. So I have two preliminary answers to the question of transition, which is I do not have it in full yet. Okay. And prior to the 7th of October, I adopted indeed a more gradual understanding for our conflict, more building on what happened in Northern Ireland, looking in long processes that are changing the root causes of the conflict. That if I analyze the root causes of conflicts as based on great discrepancies between groups. So what I see also in Northern Ireland is a gradual uplifting of the Catholic minority, which is explaining for me why peace agreement that had been signed on the same parameters in 672 in Northern Ireland failed, and why the same parameters of the peace agreement had succeeded in 98. There are a lot of reasons why, right? But part of it is that the closing of the gaps between the sides and the ability that they will then share power. Before that, it was inconceivable for the majority of Protestants. I think, so I adopted that vision as a transition, and I think in any case, it is needed. I think after the 7th of October, I moved to the Bosnian example. And it means that because of the extreme levels of violence we saw, and because, so there are a lot of reasons why, but I think what is needed is a serious international intervention, including boots on the ground in a way that that makes the situation stable and then gradually builds it after after intervention, not prior to agreement. That's my short answer to that.
Floor is open. A lot of questions. Comments.
Maybe you can address briefly this religion issue.
Briefly. Okay, so my analysis of conflicts, as you can understand, is that they are rooted in ethnic. They are ethnic, and this is the definition. Religious is part of the ethnic identity of groups. So it's not reducing ethnic religious only to that. Okay, but so the religious component is basically even the Bosnian case. Okay, the sides are identify themselves or by others. You know, Bosnia was a totally multi-ethnic state. A lot of people before the war didn't know who they belonged to. Many of them identified themselves as Yugoslavs. There were mass demonstrations in Sarajevo before the first elections that not to allow for parties that define themselves in national terms to run for politics. Once they didn't succeed, okay, there were mass demonstrations against it. Once the elections started, according to those according to these definitions, the elections in Bosnia are regarded as a census. Okay? It's not, you are electing your party, or you have two parties too, but ethnically. So in this case, what you see is totally secular society that is divided along religious identity divisions. So religious there is a marker for whose group am I. So And in Northern Ireland, also we have the religion as part of the markers, in other cases as well, in Cyprus as well, in Israel, Palestine, although the Palestinians are not only Muslims, but they are predominantly a Muslim ethno-national collective.
Israeli-Palestinian conflict actually transformed from a light ethnic conflict to a fundamental religion.
So, okay, so then the question of religion, and of course how do we deal with that? So for me, and it's a question that needs to be dealt much more. There is a role of religion, and what you can see is as a mutual influence of the two. So I think the first part is that the religion is part of and enrolled into the national campaign, and then you see how religion itself is being influenced. And we can see it also in the Jewish circles, being more and more fundamental as part of the national agenda, nationalistic.
If I can, I mean, I think first of all, the three other examples is essentially European and the Israel. I mean, essentially, yes. I say more or less, which I'm not sure is the best framework for the Middle Eastern situation, which we are in the place of religion. And especially fundamentalist religion. I mean, if we look at this dispute, I'm talking our religion, we talk also about settler colonialism, but the dispute here is between two groups, or let's say the Muslim and the Jewish, who sees this land as holy. And something that, Al-Aqsa, Harabait, I mean, yes. This is something that, at least in the introduction, I didn't feel that you give enough
emphasis to this.
Independence power, I mean, which is, and also the conflict is not only in this in our actual world. As you can see, we're talking about people that are willing to sacrifice themselves. I mean, you have people calling previous generations as part of the debate, future generation. I mean, there is the whole time frame, which it seems to me, I don't know enough about the other conflict, but it seems to me that it's much more powerful here than the other.
Okay, so I think part of this is to say that the world, unfortunately, is paved with conflicts, not less hard and horrific than ours. I think that's why I started with Bosnia. And I think, although it's in Europe, you have other conflicts, horrific conflicts in Rwanda, in Burma, Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, okay? And again, you have the religious divisions there as well. And you have Japanese that are willing to sacrificing yourself for the country or for a flag. You have, in many cases, we are not unique about that. And I specifically looked at the literature about conflict, and I think this is why it's important to open up to other experiences and to what comes up as a global phenomenon. And what comes up from the empirical research is, and I'm not undermining the importance of religion here, but if you remember, I include religion as part of cultural inequality, or is part of that, okay? And usually what you see is that the culture is a trigger. You use, and I mentioned that when I described how in the literature it looks at the escalation process of conflicts, when the socioeconomic inequality is like the basic for feelings of injustice, avel, of
wrong, historical wrong.
It's more of wrongs, and then you have political elites that are excluded and therefore have an interest to mobilize the crowds, and then you have those cultural triggers that they light on the fire. but they are not by themselves. If you had all the others settled, if you had political elites that are that all the segments of society and their political elites are represented, and when you not have those extreme levels of inequality, then those political triggers might not be triggering a mass political violence. It might have been. It's not nothing in the social world is certain, right? But we're talking about what are the likelihood of how do we deal with this situation? This is the situation. We have a situation of extreme religions. What are the reasons that gave it such power? How do we deal with that? Okay, I'm not taking it as a given. I'm taking it as a phenomena, a social phenomena that we need to ask ourselves: how do we deal with that? Not in order to stop being victims of that and stop being in a way. And there are many answers, even concretely, about how do you deal with that. And I think part of the answers are these, not all of them.
Thank you very much, Limor. It was very fascinating. Congratulations on the book. And we'll meet again 2 weeks time.
24th.
24th. Great. Thanks very much.